Hey everyone, welcome to the Azure Cosmos DB Conf 2026. I'm Sajeetharan, Principal Product Manager on the Azure Cosmos DB team, driving developer experience and making agentic experience better on Azure Cosmos DB. Thanks for joining this session. As you know, Azure Cosmos DB is a database for that scales millions of developers and customers, and those customers rely on Cosmos DB for mission critical applications. It gives you single digit millisecond latency, and also it provides turnkey global distribution, multi-model support, and virtually unlimited scale. But a powerful database also means it requires a steep learning curve. You need to be an expert to build things right. You need to think about partition key design, indexing policies, RU budgeting, SDK best practices, and so on. There is a lot to get right. That's exactly where AI is changing the game. Over the past year, we have invested heavily in bringing AI directly into Cosmos DB developer experience, right inside your editor, your terminal, and also CI pipelines that you typically use. The goal is not just to make things faster, it is also to make sure that every query, every data model, and every design decision is informed by best practices from day one. Just to give an example, a few months before I asked AI to write me a Cosmos DB query, and out of the box, it without any context, it gave me select star from C with no partition key filter, and it ended up costing me 850 RUs. But then I set up the right local developer environment with few tools and best practices rules that we are going to talk about today. And I asked exactly the same question to the same AA model. This time it gave me a right partition key with the right partition aware field projected query that cost me just 5 RUs on the very first try. That sets the context for this session. I will walk you through the tools that make working with Cosmos DB easier day to day. And also we'll give a quick look at the AI features that boost your developer productivity, and also we'll wrap up with best practices that help you to build right things from the start. Let's dive on. Here is what we are going to cover today. First is the toolkit. And by toolkit, I mean a connected set of local and agentic Azure Cosmos DB development, which means the Azure Cosmos DB extension in VS Code connected with GitHub Copilot, which provides a better developer experience for end users. And second one is the vNext emulator in Docker, which we are providing to end customers for no cost local work experience. And then the third one is the Cosmos DB shell for interactive terminal queries and management through powered through MCP. And the Azure Cosmos DB MCP toolkit finally for building agentic experience and apps with Cosmos DB. Together, these gives you a complete set to explore data, generate queries, refine code, and work with AI in one flow. Then we are going to cover context and prompting, including how context files are generated and how team instructions can guide AI output, and how the Cosmos DB agent kit adds more than 71 rules. So recommendations are aligned with Cosmos DB best practices. We will also look at the brownfield and greenfield approaches, depending on whether you are starting from existing containers or designing from scratch. And we will close with the Cosmos DB emulator integration test, because AI generated output is only useful when it's validated and verified. Most of this session is a live demo using VS Code. So these slides are just to set up the context. Let me introduce a set of new capabilities that we have announced to make the agentic experience better on Azure Cosmos DB, on top of the extension workflows that typically developers use. The Azure Cosmos DB extension is purposely built for working with Azure Cosmos DB from VS Code. Let me describe this experience as a story instead of just explaining this in a slide. Imagine I'm a developer who has just connected to Azure Cosmos DB account in VS Code, and I want uh, help that actually understand my database instead of giving me just generic suggestions. The first experience that we are providing to end customers is the Cosmos DB chat participant, where I can ask questions in natural language about my containers, about schema and queries, and it responds using my live connection, so the answers are grounded in my actual data. Once I understand what is the purpose, then I can move on to write a query in natural language because I can describe what I want in English, and then the extension generates the NoSQL query using the real schema and then shows up the RU charges when I run it so that you don't have to worry about the cost. As I keep on building, the next part is the Copilot skills. I also need the AI to guide towards the right Cosmos DB patterns, not just valid syntax, and also it needs to guide me with the best practices. That's where the Copilot skills comes in, because they bring the right knowledge for partitioning or anything that you do with Cosmos DB, and also they let you to add custom skills and guidance on top. So that's where the Copilot skills comes in play when you're thinking about agentic development. And finally, when I actually start writing the real code, the experience gets even better with the schema-aware completions, so that we are providing the support within the VS Code extension to complete queries with the actual field names and the schema shapes from the connected containers instead of just guessing. So the journey here is simple by using these four features which we have in preview, and you can connect your data, you can ask queries, ask questions, generate queries, and then you can get guided by best practices within the skills, and then write this schema aware code so that you can complete end-to-end app within VS Code itself. Let me talk a bit about the local developer experience that we are providing via the toolkit. Imagine I'm starting a new feature from the Cosmos DB app, and the first thing I need is the local environment that behaves like the real service on Azure without waiting for cloud resources or spending money while I iterate on development. That's where the Cosmos DB vNext emulator comes in. It runs in Docker, it starts quickly, it purges data, and it becomes the foundation for everything I'm going to show from now on. Once I have that local database running, the next thing I want is the fast way to inspect data and validate ideas without leaving the workflow or writing a throwaway code just to test a query. That's where the Cosmos DB shell comes in. It gives me an interactive CLI where I can browse databases and containers and run ad hoc queries and insert documents right from the terminal. And once that local environment is in place, the next step is to bring AI into the workflow. That is not just to build application. It is something that also should be very useful. So you can not just chat about Cosmos DB in the abstract manner, but it also lets to understand the data structure, the schema, and you can interact with database in a structured way. That's where the MCP server comes in, because it gives the AI agents in a controlled way to discover schema, read data, work against the same environment that I'm using as a developer. So the story here is simple. Start with local emulator, explore and validate with the shell, and then unlock agentic workflows using the MCP toolkit. So these are three components that we provide to end users as a way to work locally. A lot of customers already have data in Azure Cosmos DB and they want to use AI to move faster, but they don't want the AI to make random guesses about schema, partition keys, and team conventions that they typically do for building applications. So the first thing here we need is the context. That's what you see on the left. Then the Cosmos DB context file describes the schema, partition keys, and document shape. The Copilot instructions file capture the team rules. Like always include the partition key whenever you are writing a query or in a where clause, and then instead of just writing select star, provide the right where clause conditions, and then you also need to log the RU charge. And in terms of SDK, you have to use singleton client. So these are some of the best practices that you can provide to agent as the best practices. So those get loaded into the AI experience every time when you are building application. The second thing is the reliable best practice guidance. That's what you see in the center, the Cosmos DB agent kit. Cosmos DB agent kit can be called as a Cosmos DB expert who sits besides you to guide you with the best practices to build applications on Cosmos DB. It's an open source toolkit and it has more than 71 rules across more than 8 categories. So you just need to install with single command using the npx skills add Azure Cosmos DB agent kit. Now now the AI is not just looking at your data; it is also guiding uh, you with the Cosmos DB best practices for data modeling and what are the concept that you typically deal in Cosmos DB. So that's what you see here, and we have categorized as critical, high, and medium. It also works across all ecosystem. It works with Copilot, Cloud Code, Cursor, Gemini, and so on. And then on the right side, you see two customer paths. One is the brownfield, and the other one is the greenfield. Brownfield is a customer who already has containers on Cosmos DB and a real production data, so that they sample few documents and generate context from whatever they already have. Greenfield is the customer designing a new application, so they can describe their access patterns and let AI suggest the best practices in terms of indexes and schema and so on. The key point is that reliable AI doesn't happen from one thing alone. It comes from layering customer data, team conventions, and best practices together. That's how you go from normal application to generic or agentic AI application output. So something you can actually trust in a real Cosmos DB application. So during the demo, I will show how to use these components in order to build an effective Cosmos DB application. In terms of prompting and testing, first prompting, if your prompt is basic, then as expected, the output is going to be basic as well. If your prompt is going to be specific, then the output will be much better. So always include the container, partition key, filters, and RUs that you're expecting as part of output. And you need to create a template of what exactly you want to have as a prompt. For example, I have put better prompt to write or generate a query. A simple way to think about this, right? Tell AI what data you want, from where, and how much it should cost. Uh, if you share those three things, you usually get a reusable query in one pass. So you can reuse the same prompt across your application. Second, testing. We use the Cosmos DB emulator. So you can use the emulator to emulate all the operations that you typically do with Cosmos DB. The emulator is already in pair with the actual service. So you can use the emulator locally and in CI/CD pipelines as well. So with XUnit and async lifetime, we get one database per test class and clean data for each test scenarios. We can check both queries and results and RU cost in one single go. This is important because a query can return the right data and still it can be too expensive. We want both correctness as well as efficiency before the code goes to production. I will show a quick demo on how to run test on the Phoenix emulator. Here is the demo or the roadmap for the demo. It's 10 steps in one continuous flow, and you will be seeing all the features that I explained so far. So we start the demo by launching the emulator, and then we explore the seeded data, and then use a Cosmos DB chat participant to ask questions about our containers, and then let's move on to natural language query experience, and then we open the Cosmos DB shell to interact with the Cosmos DB account, and finally we will see a sample prompt to turn we will do a brownfield extract followed by setting up the context file for a new application, and then finally I will show a end-to-end test on the emulator. Let's go ahead and switch to VS Code now, and then we will see the demo. Let me start the demo with the emulator. In order to run the emulator, you need to have the Docker uh, running. So I have started the Docker desktop in my local environment. And the next step is to start the emulator. So I have a script set up as part of the VS Code experience. So I have all the files that are required for this demo. You can check there is a file called start uh, demo. So I'm going to execute that particular file. It's a PowerShell script that executes certain commands to start the emulator, and also it set up the data. So we are going to add particular data in this particular scenario, which is the e-commerce application scenario. So I'm going to seed 200 plus products as well as 200 plus orders, you can see the emulator is ready. And also as part of the process, I'm setting up the certificates, which is required to run the emulator locally. I can see that data is generated. It has added the data. The next step I'm going to do is to use the VS Code extension for Cosmos DB. If you're new to VS Code extension, you can go to extension tab and search for Azure Cosmos DB. So we are releasing um, often with more features in order to use the native capabilities within the VS Code. And I also want to show that the emulator has started. So this is the portal that we ship with the emulator. And if you want to go to Explorer, you can see the database, you can see the container, and so on. So I have the e-commerce DB and I have the orders collection as well as the products. And also you can do all the operations within this portal as well, like executing queries, viewing data, and so on. With that, I have installed the extension already. So you will see this Azure icon on the side navigation bar. So you can connect to live Azure Cosmos DB account by opening the subscription in preview. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show the local develop experience. So by default, it's going to connect to the local emulator, which I'm running locally. And also you can see that it has loaded up the e-commerce database with orders and products containers. The first feature I'm going to show as part of the VS Code extension is to open query editor. So the VS Code extension powers um, the user to run queries, manage data, add data, and so on. And then you have the capability to view in different formats, and we provide a lot more features you can explore offline. In this scenario, I'm going to provide the AI assisted feature to generate a query. I'm going to pass a natural language prompt saying that, yeah, say I want to get electronics products which are more than $500 and then order by descending. So in this case, let me pass this prompt. And then users can select any model which comes as part of the GitHub chat mode. So in this case, you can see list of models here. And then in this case, I'm going with Cloud Opus 4.6. The same experience is provided as a GitHub Copilot chat mode. So let me run this generate query experience. It should automatically generate the NoSQL query in order to retrieve these products at one go. So you can wait until the query get generated. Let me run this to see the output. So as you can see, it has generated the query correctly, and then I can see the products which are more than $500 ordered by descending. Now, if you have questions about how this query is getting generated or want to understand more about the structure of the query as a new user, you can use this chat mode experience. Basically, we have provided the Cosmos DB chat experience for end users to ask questions, edit query, explain query, generate query. You can ask for help and more. So in this case, I'm going to demonstrate two commands. One is the explain query. Let me go ahead and use the explain query. It's going to use whatever the query that I have opened in the editor mode, and it's going to analyze the query that is auto-generated, and it will provide an explanation of what the components are and what are the performance tips that I need to consider in order to make the query faster and efficient. Yeah, you can see that it has automatically generated the purpose of the query. As I explained, we are going to retrieve the products from products containers belong to the electronics category, and then it explains what are the components of this particular query structure, and also it comes with some of the performance tips. And then we also provide the edit query experience where I can ask more filter experience, saying that I want to add a filter where inventory is less than 50 if I'm running out of stocks, and then also filter out ratings.average. So this takes this prompt as an input, and then it's going to modify the current query, which is in the editor mode, and it will ask two type of questions: whether I want to update the query or whether I want to use the query and compare along with the existed query. So that's kind of the experience that we provide to users to understand what it has changed. So it's going to generate in few seconds. Okay, it has generated a query with whatever the structured output that I wanted. You can see that it has added average ratings.average as the output field, and also it comes with inventory c.inventory where c.inventory is less than 50. So that's the power of using natural language generated queries with chat participant. So you can ask questions about containers, you can ask questions about queries, update query, and then you can compare how it has generated query before versus with additional inputs. So that's kind of the second part of the demo where I wanted to show a couple of features like AI generated query experience and also the chat participant. The third experience that I'm going to showcase is the Cosmos DB shell. Basically, for quick operations, the shell is the fastest path. I can insert data, I can interact with Cosmos DB using the shell. So let me go back to the extension, and we are providing this experience to launch the Azure Cosmos DB shell. So it's going to um, open the so I can launch the shell or the database in one go. So it's going to connect the shell directly. And also you can see this message MCP running on port 6128. Basically, we are powering the MCP shell, powering the Cosmos DB shell using an MCP, which comes as a part of the VS Code extension. You can explore what are the tools supported using the Azure Cosmos DB MCP um, also Azure Cosmos DB Shell MCP. So there are plenty of tools that we expose to developers, which you can run as a standalone shell experience as well as the MCP experience using the natural language. So in this case, I'm going to ask a simple question saying, connect me to the local emulator with um, the shell and show me the latest inserted products. It's going to take a few minutes because it has to identify what are the tools that are supported as part of the shell experience, and then it will execute what are the specific tools that needs to be executed in order to retrieve the recently inserted data. And it automatically identified which tool to get executed in this particular case. So it uses a connect tool to connect to the local emulator, and it also automatically identified what is the account endpoint for my local emulator. It also identified what is the key needs to be used in this experience. And as I explained, you can see it has used the tool ls to list the containers. It has gone into the products containers using the automated way to identify which tool to be executed, and it's also going to execute list queries to um, generate a query to get the latest added products. Okay, it has connected to the shell automatically using the MCP powered experience, and also you can see the latest products here. So it has executed set of commands as part of the shell experience, which you can independently execute when you install the shell separately using the NuGet package that we provide, or as part of the connected experience, you can use the MCP experience to interact with natural language. So that's part of the demo that I wanted to show as part of the shell experience. So we have covered the AI assisted query experience, the chat participant to interact with Cosmos DB, and also the shell to interact with typical developer scenarios. Moving on to the next experience, how to build the right solution using the best practices and also the context or prompting techniques, right? So that's where we have shipped the Cosmos DB agent kit. So basically, we are powering the Cosmos DB developer experience with more than 71 Cosmos DB best practices provided as part of the agent kit, which guides you to build the Cosmos DB application in the right manner. So good AI output comes from a good context plus a specific prompt. In this repo, I have added a specific context file, which you can reuse in your day-to-day development scenarios. And that comes with a set of instructions that you can add more as well. For example, in your development environment, you need to consider certain aspects. You can add those as instructions. So these are some of the good practices that you can typically use as part of the develop experience. Now, coming back to the uh, agent kit that we ship as part of the VS Code extension. So I'm going to type this prompt. review my e-commerce as a Cosmos DB NoSQL schema using the Cosmos DB best practices, and then I'm adding certain key inputs to validate what it needs to focus on. So it's going to refer the Cosmos DB best practices skills that comes as a part of the agent kit in order to build this application. So you can see that it has referred Cosmos DB best practices, and it's going to come up with a lot of suggestions that I need to adhere in order to make this application more efficient. Let it execute on its own. Let me go back to the prompting instructions that I have given here. So it's going to reuse some of the best practices that typically developers use in production uh, scenarios. So you can go through this offline. We have this repo published as well. So with that, let me move on to the next step, which is the prompting. Prompting, it varies from different scenarios. One of the simple technique that I want to mention is that if the prompt is simple, then output is usually too broad. Uh, but you need to include certain key instructions, as I mentioned during the presentation, which are very specific to Cosmos DB, like partition key and what fields you need to return as output and what is the expected RUs and so on. So good context always helps, but a good prompt also matters. So I have provided some of the example prompts that you can typically use in your day-to-day development scenarios. And also I have provided some Copilot prompts that you can reuse in the workspace in the GitHub Copilot chat. Final, I want to show the Cosmos DB emulator to run the integration test. If you are using Cosmos DB emulator for your development scenario, that is the best case. You can build applications at no cost. So let me use the emulator to run a particular integration test. So let me open a new terminal. It's going to test the end-to-end scenario test as part of the Cosmos DB integration test that I have put against the emulator. You can see it's going to execute those tests, and at the end, I should see the output as all green. So it's running the test right now. So this is where the emulator gives us a big advantage, right? So this integration runs again the same local Azure Cosmos DB environment that we use in the demo, so that you can use the same applications against the live Azure Cosmos DB account. So the results are consistent on every machine. That's what we use within Azure Cosmos DB to validate some of the SDK scenarios. They validated the real CRUD and query behavior, and you can also verify the RU expectations before anything goes to production. That means faster development with more confidence and fewer surprises later. So this is where the agentic experience comes in. You also need to validate against the generated code using the AI against the emulator so that you can verify certain scenarios. So the key takeaway is that simple: one local emulator with AI-assisted agentic experience to generate queries and add integrations using the one repeatable loop using the context files and using the agent kit to align with the best practices. Um, you can protect the quality using the skills that we are providing as part of the agent kit. That is the developer experience that comes as a part of the VS Code extension that we provide to end customers. So without leaving the VS Code editor, you can use the end-to-end flow in order to build a production application using Azure Cosmos DB. That summarizes the demo. Let me go back to the slide to uh, announce few takeaways. So you can use the dev environment with all the local tools that I have demonstrated. Some of the AI features that I mentioned, Cosmos DB chat experience, the NL to query generation. You can use the MCP shell toolkit, and also the shell and testing experience that comes as part of the emulator, and finally the repeatable workflows that you can use it in your development scenarios. These are some of the key resources that I would recommend you to go through. We have the Copilot instructions, we have the best practices shipped as agent kit, and we have the MCP toolkit for bringing the AI agentic experience as part of the Cosmos DB. And I also have the demo repo, which comes with the best practices and prompts that you can reuse. I would recommend you to go through the VS Code extension. If you are not familiar with VS Code extension, I would highly recommend to use VS Code extension to build applications on Cosmos DB. You can view the extension using this URL and also provide the feedback using this survey. And if you got any feedback, you can raise it on GitHub repo, Cosmos DB VS Code Cosmos DB in GitHub. And then if you have any questions, reach out to me or on our social channels if you have any feedback or questions. With that, thanks for joining me in this session. Have a fantastic Azure Cosmos DB Conf 2026. See you again later.